Welcome back to our series on the New Deal APUSH class. Hope the first video was helpful. This one is one where we're moving off of Keynesian economics and we're going to look into some of the sort of big picture structure of the New Deal. Remember, Roosevelt wins the election and is in a position where he has to do something very, very quickly. There's a whole bunch of problems that he's got to deal with in one short span. Largely because the Hoover administration had really dragged its feet on doing anything. Hoover did not believe in government intervention, and so he ended up not doing anything, and that became a very serious issue as this cycle got worse. All right. So the New Deal reform programs are sort of organized, I would organize them into some categories. The first one is economic stimulus and stabilization. These are programs that are largely aimed at putting money into the economy or adjusting something about the economy that is going to put more money in people's pockets. Moving to a more income tax-based model. We'd already had the income tax, but shifting the government onto a much more income tax-based model is a piece of that. Why? Because the people hardest hit are generally poor. They have the least amount of money. The income tax is going to hit the rich harder. Fine, that's the intent of it. It actually manages to increase government revenues without raising the tax burden on the poor and making things worse that way. That was a big piece. Things like adjusting agricultural prices, actually starting to pay farmers not to grow certain crops to prevent an oversupply and undersupply situation. Those sorts of things. Okay. Bank and financial reform. There's a bunch of things that go in here, but there's two that are definitely worth remembering. The first one is the FDIC, Federal Depositor Insurance Corporation. Basically, the banks were in a state of free fall. They were closing like crazy when Roosevelt took office. One of the first things he did was basically order all banks closed by executive order. Every bank in the country was closed for a period of time. During that time, you couldn't withdraw money from the bank, you couldn't put money in the bank, you could not access any money in the bank. It did put people in a funny position for a period, but during that time, he also created the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And what that is that's something that all the banks are required by law to pay into. To be a bank in the United States, you have to pay into this. And when something really, really bad happens, that money that is collected is then used to, fix the banks, to ensure that depositors get their money if a bank's closed. This could apply to bank robbery. This could apply to economic closures, mismanagement, any of those things. So if you're a depositor, your money is guaranteed in that bank up to I think it's $250,000, but I'd have to check where they raise it every few years. So for most of us, we're pretty well covered. If you had $10 million in the bank, yeah, you're only covered for the first, $250,000, but you probably don't all have it in one bank account if you get 10 million, or at least I hope you don't. All right. The other one is the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, this is one that's been sort of nerfed in recent years, and we paid for it in 2008, but this regulation created a divide between investment banking and commercial and regular old banking. Basically, if a bank was going to get involved in risky investments, they could not do it with the money that was being taken in terms of, investors' deposit, their account holders' deposits. It had to be with the bank's own money. And the theory behind that is that if the bank lost all of its own money, fine, whatever, but it's not losing the money of the people who have accounts there. Unfortunately, this has been sort of nerfed in recent years, and part of the 2008 issue was that lack of regulation. Banks got themselves into big trouble and had to be bailed out by the government. That's the whole point of Glass-Steagall, was to avoid that situation, so banks could only lose the bank's money, not the people who were account holders. It's a very significant problem. All right, so those are two that are talking about the banks. Relief and welfare. These are programs that are meant to sort of help people on an individual level. Some of them were short-term, some of them are incredibly long-term. Social Security comes out of this. Social Security is a relief and welfare program that comes out of the New Deal that is still around and most people count on. It is in trouble right now, again, because we did not collect the taxes, collect the money to fund it properly. We didn't account for a baby boom generation and then a fall in birth rates after, but this program is still around 70 odd years later. So that's a big one. Public works programs. This was a way to get people back to work and do something useful for the United States. Public works programs were like dams, roads, working on the national forest, anything that needed doing, levees, flood protection, all that stuff. The government realized that labor was suddenly very, very cheap because a lot of people needed jobs, so that they could get a hold of people to work for not very much money. That means that any money they invested, they were going to get the best bang for their buck, and people would be thrilled to have any work possible. And there's a whole bunch of organizations that did this, and I'm expecting you to know those, but the one that affects our area most directly is the Civilian Conservation Corps. A lot of the road systems, a lot of the trail systems, a lot of the bridges, a lot of the stuff that was built in the National Forest and New Hampshire State Parks was built at this time. If you're ever at a state park and you see a really nice stone bridge, it's probably a Civilian Conservation Corps bridge. What these did, these hired out lots of young, unattached men to come out to the wilderness and do projects in, again, national forests, national parks, state forests, state parks, that kind of thing. The pay wasn't great, but if your choice was no work or this, it was a pretty good deal. And you certainly got your exercise. The picture behind me is actually from Campton, where they were doing some work on the National Forest lands in Campton. You saw this in Bethlehem. You saw this all over the National Forest. So this was an important one, but there were all kinds of stuff. One of the downsides that we've discovered to this, doing it all at once at a discount price, was that all of those things start to wear out at about the same time. There's a number of sort of New Deal dams kicking around that are in bad shape and have to be fixed all at once. It's a pretty small downside as things go, but it is a downside. The other one I should mention is the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority took the Tennessee River and a lot of rivers connected to it and built a series of hydro dams that basically provided power for the near Midwest in a large quantity. Those same dams are still operational today. Most of them have been fixed up and kept up because they are very profitable and very necessary. But this is one of those areas where hydropower suddenly gets real big in the United States very quickly. It's because you could invest in it at that point and get big dividends. So this is when we talk about public works. And finally, this is a smaller one. You don't see as much money put into this, but it is very public. You have arts and culture. The government started to finance artists who produced all kinds of stuff. A lot of murals were painted in cities at this time by artists. A lot of new works and new writings are all come up with, and they're paid by the government with the intent of, again, making sure that the artistic life of the country doesn't die off during a recession, as it often does. I'm not going to say this had a huge impact economically, but in terms of making cities a nicer place to be, yeah, it did. And it actually started a trend for city mural painting that is still around today. All right, so these are just, again, some of the structures that we're going to talk about. Each one of these has half a dozen, 2 dozen programs within it. The alphabet soup, and I'm going to get into the alphabet soup in the next video, but this is just, again, giving you sort of the broad strokes. What these are ways to try and prevent the economy from getting worse, try and get people back to work in one way, shape, or form. Go back to your Keynesian economics. If people are back to work, people have money to spend. If people have money to spend, then businesses are going to do better. If businesses are going to do better, they're going to hire more people, and that's how you get yourself out of one of these, one of the depressions or recessions. That's the theory, and it actually does work very, very well. Don't get me wrong, World War II coming is going to have a real big impact on this too, in the fact that the U.S., again, like in World War I, is going to become a massive arsenal in grain production for a number of countries. But it is important to remember that the Great Depression did not get worse than it did, largely because of these efforts. Again, you see similar things in 2008. The reason we call 2008 the Great Recession and not the Great Depression is that the government did spend a lot of money on very similar programs. All right, we will get into the alphabet soup of all the programs next time. Thank you very much. Stay safe.